When you discover that the intimate clothing you cherish and store so carefully is disappearing from your closet, and the culprit is the man who shared your bed for 15 years, life is never the same again. Hello, my dears. My name is Dorothy Mae Wilson, and I'm 75 years old today. But this story I'm going to tell you happened when I was just 32, back in 1982. Before I continue, if you're enjoying this story, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing my story is reaching so many different places. You know, life was different back then. I lived in such a small town in rural Nebraska that if you sneezed in the town square, you'd hear "bless you" from all four corners. Everyone knew everyone's business. We were considered the perfect couple in the community. My husband, Albert, was an accountant at the only bank branch in town, a respected man who wore a suit and tie every day, even in the scorching summer heat. I taught at the local elementary school. We had a simple but dignified life. A small 3-bedroom house with a backyard where I grew dahlias that were the envy of the neighborhood. We had 3 wonderful children: Christopher, our oldest, who was 12 at the time, Madison, the middle child, who was 10, and Jacob, our little one, who was 8. They were studious, well-mannered, and attended church every Sunday. Albert was extremely strict about their upbringing. "Children of mine have to toe the line," he would always say. Back then, I thought that was a virtue. Now looking back, I see so many warning signs. Our routine was always the same. I woke up at 5 a.m., prepared breakfast for everyone, got the children ready for school, and made the lunches. Albert left punctually at 7:30 for the bank. I took the children to school, where I also taught. In the afternoon when we returned, I prepared dinner and waited for Albert to arrive at 6. On Sundays, we all attended the 10 o'clock service together. Pastor Anderson was like family. He baptized all 3 of our children, gave spiritual counsel, and visited our home for coffee at least once a month. It all started on a Sunday in May. The air was getting fresher, announcing the approach of summer. There was a 4th of July picnic being organized by the church, and as always, I volunteered to help. That Sunday, I needed to arrive early to help Sister Catherine with the preparations. "You go ahead with your father," I told the children. "Mom's going to help Sister Catherine with the raffle tickets." The morning passed quickly between cutting cards, organizing prizes, and recording donations. When we finished, it was almost time for the service. "I'll go through the back way, Sister, to save time," I told Sister Catherine. The church grounds backed onto an alleyway that would get me closer to the side entrance where my family usually sat. I left through the back door of the sacristy, and it was there, at that moment, that my life began to crumble, although I didn't know it yet. Something on the ground caught my attention. It was a colorful fabric, tangled in a honeysuckle bush. I approached and recognized it immediately. My red wool scarf with floral embroidery. It was handmade by my late mother before she passed away. It was one of a kind in the world, with those hand-embroidered flowers, each one a different color. It made no sense. We were heading into summer, true. But that specific scarf was stored at the bottom of my closet. I rarely wore it because the colors were too flashy for my modest taste. And besides, I was absolutely certain I hadn't taken it out of the closet that season. I picked up the scarf, shook off the dust, and wrapped it in my purse. Throughout the entire service, I couldn't pay attention. My head was buzzing with questions. How did my scarf end up there? Had someone broken into our house? Did the children take it to play with? But they knew the sentimental value of that piece. They would never treat it carelessly. When we got home, I waited until the children were distracted with toys in the yard and showed the scarf to Albert. "Look what I found tossed near the back door of the church. Isn't that strange? Someone must be entering our house." His reaction intrigued me right away. He turned pale, as if he'd seen a ghost, and stammered when he answered. "Oh, you must have forgotten it there on some other visit to the church, Dottie." He only called me Dottie when he was nervous. "That's impossible, Albert. This scarf has been stored away since last winter. I haven't even taken it out of the closet this year." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture he always made when anxious. Maybe the kids took it for some game. You know how they are. But I already asked them on the way back. None of them touched the scarf. Then you must be mistaken. Perhaps you wore it and forgot. With so many things to worry about, it's normal to forget these little things. He gave a forced smile and quickly changed the subject. What's for lunch? I'm starving. At that moment, I thought he was just worried about the possibility of thieves. After all, who wouldn't be? If someone was entering our house, we could all be in danger. But something in his reaction didn't seem right. It was as if he knew more than he was saying. In the days that followed, I started paying more attention, and that's when I noticed strange things happening. My silk blouses, the ones I only wore for special occasions, were being stored still damp in the closet. When I took them out to iron, I noticed water stains on the folds, as if someone had hastily washed them and put them away without drying them properly. There was also a different perfume on some of my skirts. It wasn't a feminine perfume, nor was it the soap we used at home. It was a different smell, something between musk and incense. At the time, I couldn't identify it, but today I know exactly what it was. One day I found a tear on the side of my favorite dress, that blue one with white polka dots that I had bought in the city when we went to visit my sister. I'm absolutely certain that tear wasn't there before, as I took great care of my clothes. We didn't have money to be buying new clothes all the time. Albert's behavior also began to change. He, who was always punctual, started coming home later from work, saying he had many financial statements to close at the bank. And then he started going out on Wednesday and Friday nights, always saying he had accounting meetings with the town's merchants. The merchants need to organize their tax books, he would explain. I can't do everything during bank hours, so we scheduled these extra meetings. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? Albert had never given me reason to doubt. He was a serious, hard-working man, dedicated to his family, but there was something different about these outings. He always wore a large brown overcoat, even when the weather wasn't that cold. When I asked why he wore that heavy coat, he said the nights got chilly during the meetings that went on for hours. One detail that started to bother me was that he always showered before leaving for these so-called meetings. I need to look presentable, he'd say. But why shower for a simple accounting meeting? He was already clean. He'd showered when he got home from the bank. And then came the discovery that made all the pieces start to fit together. One day, while putting away clothes in our bedroom, I opened the drawer of my vanity and noticed that my pink lipstick, a rare gift my sister had brought me from the city, had a strangely worn tip. I always applied lipstick carefully, maintaining the original shape, but now the tip was flattened, as if someone had pressed hard against their lips. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at that lipstick for minutes as a chill ran up my spine. Who could have been using my lipstick? One of the children? But the boys would never be interested in that, and Madison knew she couldn't touch my things without asking. There was something else happening in my house, right under my nose, and I needed to find out what it was. That same afternoon, unable to keep these suspicions to myself any longer, I went to my friend Florence's house. She was the widow of the town's former pharmacist, Mr. Harold. God rest his soul. Florence was about 10 years older than me, an experienced and trustworthy woman, one of the few in town who didn't live on gossip. I told her everything: the scarf found at church, the damp clothes, the strange perfume, the tear in the dress, the used lipstick, and, of course, Albert's nighttime outings with that enormous overcoat. Florence listened in silence, her eyes widening more and more. When I finished, she held my hands in hers and said gravely, "Dorothy, my dear, I'm almost certain what's happening. Your husband must be taking your clothes to another woman." That hit me like a bomb to my already aching heart. But thinking about it, it made sense. Albert must have been hiding my clothes under that huge overcoat to take them to another woman. Maybe it was a poor woman who didn't have nice clothes, or maybe he liked seeing her wearing my things. The idea devastated me, tore me up inside. But who would this woman be, Florence? Who in our town would do such a thing to me? That, my friend, We'll only find out by investigating. The next time he leaves with that coat, we need to follow him. This town is small. It won't be difficult to discover where he goes." The following night was Wednesday, and as expected, Albert announced he would have his meeting. He showered, put on cologne, wore the overcoat, and left. I quickly went to Florence's house, as we had arranged, and that's how my journey to discover the truth began. A truth that would change my life forever. A truth I could never have imagined, not even in my worst nightmares. That Wednesday evening was the day my innocence died forever. The night was colder than normal for May, with a fine mist covering the cobblestone streets of our small town. The streetlights created yellowish halos that barely broke through the fog, giving an almost ghostly air to the scene. Florence was waiting for me at her gate. She wore a black shawl over her shoulders and had a determined expression on her face. "Let's hurry," she whispered. "We can't lose sight of him." Albert walked briskly, as he always did. Long, decisive steps, his brown overcoat swinging with each movement. We followed him at a safe distance, hiding behind trees and walls whenever he looked back, which he did frequently, as if afraid of being observed. "He's heading toward the square," I whispered to Florence. "But there's no business open there at this hour," she replied. "They've all closed." We continued following, my heart beating so hard in my chest that I feared he might hear it. The town went to bed early in those days. By 8 p.m., the streets were practically deserted, especially on an ordinary Wednesday. The only lights on were in houses where families were having dinner or gathering to listen to the 8 o'clock radio show. When Albert turned right on Maple Street, my stomach knotted. That street led directly to the church. Could he be meeting her at the church? I whispered, horrified at the possibility. "That would be the height of disrespect," Florence replied, squeezing my arm. "Let's see." And that's exactly what happened. Albert stopped in front of St. Benedict's Church, our parish. The old building, with its white walls and bell tower, was silent and dark, except for a faint light coming from the sacristy in the back. Albert looked around one last time. We quickly hid behind a tree, and then he entered through the side door, the one that was always left unlocked for devotees who wanted to pray at any time. "My God in heaven," Florence murmured. "He's meeting her in the house of the Lord." I waited a few minutes, my heart pounding in my chest as if trying to escape. 1,000 thoughts raced through my head. Who was this woman? Someone I knew? One of the mothers of my students? Perhaps the new secretary at the town hall, who always smiled too much at Albert when we crossed paths in the square? "Maybe she works at the church as a cleaner," whispered Florence, seemingly reading my thoughts. "Mrs. Clemens told me that Pastor Anderson hired a new girl to take care of the cleaning." "Let's go in," I decided. We had come this far. I needed to see with my own eyes. We crossed the small side garden and entered through the same door as Albert. The interior of the church was dimly lit, illuminated only by the votive candles burning at the altar of the Virgin Mary. The smell of wax and incense filled the air, mixed with that characteristic odor of old places, wood, mold, and sanctity. We moved silently, passing through the empty pews. The light was coming from the sacristy at the back. As we approached, I began to hear voices, one of them undoubtedly my husband's, the other I couldn't immediately identify. It was too deep to be a woman's, I thought, confused. The sacristy door was ajar. Florence and I approached slowly, careful not to let the ancient floorboards creak under our feet. We stopped at the door, hidden by the shadow, and peeked through the crack. What I saw there destroyed my world in an instant, like a sandcastle swept away by a cruel wave. Albert had removed the overcoat that now lay on a chair, but he wasn't with another woman as I had imagined. He himself was wearing my clothes, my blue dress with white polka dots, the same one I had found torn and then carefully mended. My red embroidered scarf was elegantly wrapped around his neck, and to my absolute horror, he was wearing my pearl earrings, a wedding gift from my mother, and had his face made up with the pink lipstick I had noticed was different. But that alone was a devastating shock. What came next shattered any remnant of reality I might still cling to. Pastor Anderson, yes, our pastor, the man who had baptized my 3 children, who dined at our house, who gave spiritual counsel to the entire community, was standing there before Albert and was not in shock or reprimanding him, as one would expect. No, he was caressing my husband's face with an intimacy that could only mean one thing. "You look beautiful today, my sweet Bertie," said the pastor, in a voice I had never heard him use before. Soft, almost syrupy. Bertie. He called him Bertie. That was the nickname only I used for Albert in our most intimate moments. It was our joke, something private, sacred. The air fled from my lungs. I felt as if I'd been punched in the stomach. My knees weakened, and if it weren't for Florence holding my arm, I would have collapsed right there. I don't know what possessed me at that moment. Maybe it was the pain, the anger, the shock. Maybe it was the instinct of a betrayed woman, not just by her husband, but by the entire life I believed I had. I let out a scream that echoed throughout the church, a sound that didn't even seem human, born from the depths of my lacerated soul. "Albert!" The 2 men froze. The scene was etched in my memory like a terrible photograph. Albert, dressed in my clothes, made up, his eyes wide with terror. Pastor Anderson, with his hand still suspended in the air, inches from my husband's face. "Dorothy, it's not what you're thinking," stammered Albert with that cliché phrase that all betrayers seem to know by heart. But it was exactly what I was thinking. Worse. "How could you both?" I managed to say, my voice broken by sobs. "In God's house?" Pastor Anderson recovered first. With the dignity that I now knew was just a mask, he straightened his shoulders and spoke with his sermon voice. "Dorothy, you need to understand." "Understand? Understand what exactly, Pastor?" I shouted, my voice echoing off the sacred walls. "That my husband wears my clothes to meet with you? That everything we lived was a lie? That the man who baptized my children is—" I couldn't complete the sentence. It was too painful to put into words what I was seeing. Albert tried to approach, but I backed away in disgust. Seeing that man, the father of my children, the man with whom I'd shared my bed for 15 years, wearing my dress, my lipstick, my earrings, was as if everything I knew about the world had collapsed. "Don't come near me," I hissed. "Never come near me or my children again." And then I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I ran out of the church, away from that nightmare, with Florence following me. I ran through the dark, empty streets, tears streaming down my face, the cold night air cutting my lungs. I ran to Florence's house, unable to return to what I once called home. "You'll stay here tonight," she said, taking me inside. "Tomorrow we'll think about what to do." But I knew there was nothing to think about. My life, as I knew it, had ended in that sacristy. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the guest bed in Florence's house, staring at nothing, reliving every moment of the last few months, identifying the signs I should have seen. How was I so blind? How did I not notice what was happening under my own roof? The next morning, the entire town already knew. I never discovered if it was Pastor Anderson who spread the story, trying to get ahead and give his version, or if it was someone who saw us entering the church that night. In small towns, the walls have ears, and secrets spread faster than wind. When I finally gathered the courage to return home, I found Albert putting clothes in a suitcase. He was no longer wearing my dress, of course. He was back in his gray suit, impeccable, as if the night before had been just a feverish nightmare. "I'm leaving," he said, not looking me in the eyes. "It's better for everyone." "And your children?" I asked, my voice hoarse from so much crying. "Is it better for them too?" He finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never noticed before, a mixture of shame, relief, and freedom. "They'll be better without me, Dottie. You know that." "Where are you going?" "To the city. Anderson." He hesitated before pronouncing the name. "The pastor has already requested a transfer to a parish there." So they had everything planned, to run away together, to abandon everything, the parish, the family, the responsibilities, leaving behind the broken pieces for me to pick up alone. "And money?" I asked, pragmatic even amid the emotional storm. "How will I support our children?" Albert opened the drawer of the dresser and took out an envelope. "This is all I can leave now. I sold my father's gold watch." I took the envelope without opening it. I knew it wouldn't be enough, but it was all I would get. "What do I tell the children?" I asked, feeling the weight of that impossible question. He closed the suitcase with a dry click. "The truth if you want, or make something up. Say I had to travel for work, that I died. Anything." "Coward," I murmured, but he pretended not to hear. He picked up the suitcase and walked to the door. Before leaving, he stopped and said without turning, "I'm sorry, Dorothy. I never meant to hurt you." And then he was gone, out the front door, in broad daylight, as if he had every right to simply abandon the life we had built. Later, I discovered that he had withdrawn almost all of our savings from the bank before fleeing. The little he left in the envelope would barely cover a month's expenses. He and Pastor Anderson had departed for the city on the 10 o'clock bus, as I later learned from Mrs. Carmen at the bus station. 2 men with large suitcases buying one-way tickets to Chicago. That's how, at 32, I found myself alone with 3 children to raise, without a job, because the next day I received a visit from the school principal informing me that parents didn't want the sinner's wife teaching their children anymore, and with an entire town looking at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. The scandal was the biggest our small town had ever seen. The grocery store owner's son even made up a song about the incident that the drunks would sing at the corner bar. I couldn't go to the bakery without hearing whispers, without feeling gazes burning my back. "I knew there was something wrong with that man," said the same ladies who had previously praised Albert as an exemplary family man. "I always thought Pastor Anderson was too strange," commented the same men who had revered him before. But no one had seen anything before. No one had suspected, or if they had, they preferred the comfort of silence. Now everyone was an expert at pointing out signs that no one had noticed. And I, from respected teacher and exemplary wife, became that poor thing, the abandoned one, the wife of the man who ran away with the pastor, as if my identity had been completely erased, replaced by that single, terrible event. Doors began to close for me, one by one. I lost my job at the school. The families who had previously invited me to their homes now avoided my gaze on the street. Women pulled their husbands away when I passed, as if what had happened to me was contagious. And the men, some began to look at me differently, with a predatory interest, as if an abandoned woman was easy prey, desperate for company. But worst of all were the children. How do you explain to 3 innocent children that their father had left, taking with him not only our savings and my dignity, but also the man who represented faith in their lives? I opted for a half-truth. I said that their father had gone to work in the city and that we didn't know when he would return. As for Pastor Anderson, I just said he had been transferred, as sometimes happens with pastors. Christopher, my oldest, looked at me with those eyes so similar to his father's and asked, "Will he at least send money? How are we going to live now, Mom?" 12 years old. 12 years old and already worried about money, about survival. At that moment, I hated Albert with all my strength. "We'll be fine," I replied, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Mom's going to take care of everything." And so began the most difficult phase of my life. A phase of humiliation, of closed doors, of tears hidden in the bathroom so my children wouldn't see me falter, but also a phase where I discovered a strength within me that I didn't know existed. You can't imagine what it's like to wake up every morning knowing your world has collapsed, but having to smile and pretend that everything will be all right for 3 children who depend entirely on you. Every morning was an internal battle, allowing myself a few minutes of self-pity while boiling water for coffee, then wiping away the tears, adjusting my posture, and facing the day with a determination that I was far from feeling. In the first weeks after Albert's departure, I lived off the few savings he had left and the reluctant charity of some neighbors. Mrs. Augusta, the seamstress, would bring me leftover bread from the bakery where her son worked. Mr. Joseph, the cobbler, repaired the children's shoes without charging, saying only, "You can pay when you can." Small gestures that amid the general contempt were like drops of water in the desert. But I knew charity wouldn't sustain my family for long. I needed to work, to generate income. The problem was that in a small town like ours in 1982, the options for a woman in my situation were practically non-existent. I went to the town hall, to the local businesses, to the new private school that had opened on the outskirts. In all places, I received the same uncomfortable look, the same polite excuse. "We're not hiring at the moment, Mrs. Wilson." One afternoon, returning home after another frustrated attempt to get a job, I passed by Mrs. Gertrude's yard, one of the oldest ladies in town. She was trying to hang clothes on the line, but her rheumatism made the task almost impossible. "Can I help you?" I offered without thinking much. She looked at me suspiciously. She had probably heard all the stories about me, but her physical discomfort spoke louder. "If it's not too much trouble, Mrs. Wilson." I hung all the clothes, organized the pieces by type and size, as I always did with ours. When I finished, Mrs. Gertrude offered me coffee. "You have skillful hands," she commented. "My clothes have never looked so well arranged on the line." That seemingly trivial comment lit a bulb in my mind. "Mrs. Gertrude, would you need someone to wash and iron your clothes regularly? I can do it for a fair price." That's how I got my first client for the laundry service. Mrs. Gertrude mentioned it to her friend, Mrs. Eulalia, who in turn referred me to her niece. And soon I was washing and ironing for 3 houses. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Every coin was carefully saved in an empty butter tin hidden behind a loose tile in the kitchen. The work was arduous. I would wake up at 4 a.m., light the wood stove in the yard, place the large wash basins of water to boil. My hands, once delicate as a teacher's, became rough, marked by light burns from the hot iron, cracked from the potent soap, but they were dignified hands, hands that fed my children. I soon realized that washing clothes wouldn't be enough. The money barely covered food and rent for the modest house where we had to move after the landlord of the old house, which belonged to the bank where Albert worked, asked for the property back. That's when I remembered my mother's recipes. She made the best sweets in the region, recipes that had been passed down for generations. I started making coconut candies, dulce de leche, ambrosia, custard tarts, all the sweets she taught me. Christopher, my oldest son, would sell them outside the school and in the square on Sundays. Madison took care of little Jacob while I washed clothes or cooked. Gradually, the sweets gained fame. Dottie's sweets, they called them. Some people overcame the scandal in favor of my creamy dulce de leche. Others bought through their children or maids to avoid being seen dealing with me directly. I didn't care. The money was the same. There were also the private lessons I began to give secretly. Some families, noticing that their children were having difficulty in school without my guidance, swallowed their prejudice and sought me out discreetly. "Could you give some tutoring to John? But we need it to be at our house and, if possible, come through the back door." I swallowed my pride and accepted these conditions. My children needed to eat, needed books, clothes, a minimally dignified life. Some lessons were paid in cash, others in food or favors. A repair here, a used clothing item there. The hardest part was hearing the questions from my children. "Mom, why don't the other mothers let their children play with us?" asked Jacob, my youngest, one night. "Why do we have to enter through the back door at Peter's house when you go to tutor him?" questioned Madison, more perceptive than I would have liked for her 10 years. The most painful, however, were the questions about their father. In the beginning, they came daily. "When is Daddy coming back? Did he send a letter? Why doesn't he call?" With time, the questions decreased, until they practically ceased. I don't know which was worse, the constant questions or the resigned silence that replaced them. Christopher, in particular, grew up too quickly. At 13, he got a job as a delivery boy at the pharmacy after school. He handed me every cent he earned. "To help at home, Mom," he would say, with a seriousness that broke my heart. No child should carry such a burden. It was around this time that I received the only letter from Albert, a simple envelope with the address written in that handwriting I knew so well from so many love notes I received during our courtship. Another life, it seemed now. Inside, $100 bill, a considerable amount at the time, but insignificant compared to what we needed, and a short note for the children. "Hope you're well. A." No question about how we were surviving, no explanation, no request for forgiveness. I tore the note into 1,000 pieces, but kept the money. I couldn't afford the luxury of pride. Months turned into a year, then 2. The novelty of the scandal diminished, replaced by new local dramas. I was no longer the news of the day, just that woman, from the incident with the pastor. The explicit contempt gave way to a kind of condescending pity that was somehow even more humiliating. I worked from sunrise to sunset. My hands, once protected by gloves when I went to Sunday service, were now permanently red and swollen from washing clothes. My knees ached from scrubbing the floors of houses where I began to clean to supplement my income. My eyes burned from sleepless nights, preparing sweets to sell the next day or correcting the lessons of private students I managed to get. But my children never went to bed hungry, never missed school, always had clean clothes, even if mended so many times that the original fabric was hardly recognizable. That was my small daily triumph, my silent resistance. The town continued to treat us like pariahs, but in a more subtle way. Now the boys at school teased my children, calling their father names that children shouldn't even know. The mothers continued to keep their daughters away from Madison, as if being the daughter of an absent father was something contagious. The teachers treated my children with a clinical distance, never with the warmth they showed other children. It was in this scenario that the event occurred that would mark a turning point in our story. It was June 1984, 2 years after Albert's departure. The town was preparing for the traditional 4th of July celebration, the biggest annual event in that agricultural community. There would be music, food, dancing, game booths, all the joy a small town can produce when it tries. I didn't want to go. I knew we would be observed, commented on, judged. But my children begged. "Please, Mom," asked Jacob with those big eyes that painfully reminded me of his father's. "All the children will be there." How could I deny them this small pleasure? They had already lost so much, suffered so much for mistakes that weren't theirs. So I agreed, but with a heavy heart. I wore my best dress, a simple dark blue one, already faded from so many washes, but dignified. I carefully combed my hair, tied it in a low bun. I put a little face powder on to disguise the deep circles under my eyes, marks of the difficult years. It wasn't vanity. It was armor. When we arrived at the town square, it was already full. Colorful flags hung between lampposts. The bandstand was decorated with wildflowers. The smell of snacks and sweets hung in the air. In another life, I would have helped with the organization. I would have spent weeks preparing the decorations with the other teachers. We had barely taken a few steps when I felt the stares, always the stares. People leaned toward each other, whispering behind their hands. I heard fragments. "Had the nerve to come. Should be ashamed. Poor children." I tried to ignore it by focusing on my children. I bought them cotton candy, a rare luxury I only allowed because Christopher had insisted on paying with his own money from the pharmacy. I watched as they ran to play at the fishing game booth, their faces momentarily free from the worries that had matured them prematurely. That's when I saw Mrs. Azalea, the mayor's wife, staring at me from across the square. She was with her usual circle of local society ladies. They were all looking at me, some laughing discreetly. Mrs. Azalea leaned in and said something that made the others laugh more openly. Something inside me broke. 2 years of humiliations, of closed doors, of looks of contempt, of daily struggle to maintain a minimum of dignity. 2 years of keeping quiet, lowering my head, swallowing tears so as not to worry my children. I don't know what possessed me at that moment. It was as if someone else had taken over my body, a Dorothy I didn't know, one who wasn't willing to be trampled on one more time. I walked to the center of the square, near the bandstand, where the small town band was playing a lively polka. I stopped there, right where everyone could see me, and took a deep breath. "Why do you all keep looking at me and judging me?" I shouted, my voice echoing across the square, silencing the music, freezing smiles and conversations. I wasn't the one who cheated on my husband. I had nothing to do with it. I'm tired of this town judging me. The silence was absolute now. You could hear the rustling of the leaves on the trees in the square. "You think it's easy having to take care of my children alone after my husband, who I thought was the love of my life, left me for the pastor who baptized our children? You all should think about that a bit. My children are not to blame for anything. They are innocent children. Why do you treat them as if they had some contagious disease? Why can't your children play with mine? Why do you cross the street when you see us? What did we do to deserve this?" Tears were streaming down my face now, smudging the little face powder I had applied. I didn't care. I had gone too far to turn back. "I wash your clothes, clean your houses, teach your children in secret. Aren't you ashamed to treat me like garbage during the day and then knock on my door when you need my services?" A deathly silence took over the square. I saw Christopher, Madison, and Jacob paralyzed near the fishing game booth, their eyes wide with shock. I thought I would be run out of town at that instant. Maybe it would be better to start over somewhere else where no one knew our story. But then something happened that I'll never forget. In that silent square, where my cry of despair still seemed to echo, something happened that would change the course of my life forever. Mrs. Josephine, the town midwife, a lady of almost 70 who had brought into the world half the inhabitants of that community, including my 3 children, slowly rose from the bench where she was sitting. With her wrinkled hands, marked by decades of helping children to be born, she walked toward me with firm steps despite her age. Everyone respected Mrs. Josephine. She knew the most intimate secrets of each family. Who had children before marriage? Who had more children than they could support? Who cried with disappointment instead of joy upon learning the sex of their baby? She kept these secrets like a vault, never judging, always helping. When she reached me, I thought I would receive a reprimand for causing a scandal in public. Instead, she took my hands in hers, looked into my eyes, and said loudly enough that the first rows of people could hear, "I'm proud of you, Dorothy. It's really not easy. This strength you have, few would have it." Her words were like a balm to my wounded soul. I felt the tears return, but different now, no longer of anger or humiliation, but of relief, of gratitude for this small gesture of humanity. And then something even more surprising happened. Old Mr. Anthony, the grocery store owner, who must have been about 80 and rarely left his counter, rose with difficulty, leaning on his wooden cane, and began to applaud. A slow, firm, deliberate applause. One by one, other people joined in. The seamstress Augusta, the blacksmith and his wife, some mothers of students to whom I had given lessons, workers from the sugar mill. It wasn't the whole square, far from it, but it was a significant number, perhaps a third of the people present. On the other side, I saw the mayor and his wife, Mrs. Azalea, watching the scene with evident disapproval. They stood up, noses in the air, and withdrew from the celebration, followed by their closest circle of sycophants. Some others followed their example, casting disapproving looks in my direction. But many stayed, and more importantly, many approached me afterward, offering words of support, discreet handshakes, promises of work. "My son has been doing poorly in school since you left, Mrs. Wilson," said the sugar mill worker. "Would you give him lessons? At our house, it doesn't have to be hidden." "I need someone to make sweets for my daughter's birthday next month," said the pharmacist's wife. "I've heard that yours are the best in the region." Even the school principal, the same one who had fired me 2 years earlier, approached with an embarrassed expression. "Mrs. Wilson, perhaps we can talk about the possibility of you returning to teach. It wouldn't be immediately, of course, and would probably start with just a few hours, but I could hardly believe what was happening. It was as if my desperate cry had cracked some invisible dam, releasing not only my repressed pain, but also the decency and compassion that were submerged beneath the judgment and hypocrisy of that small town. My children ran to me, hugging me by the legs, looking up with a mixture of shock and admiration. "Mom, did you yell at the mayor?" whispered Jacob, somewhere between horror and childish delight. That night, we returned home with something we hadn't felt in a long time, hope, and also with a bag of treats from the celebration, courtesy of Mrs. Josephine, who insisted we take them. "The children deserve a bit of joy," she said, filling Jacob's pockets with candy. From that day on, the town was divided. It was no longer everyone against Dorothy and her children. There were those who respected me for the courage to face prejudice, who gave me work openly, who let their children play with mine. And there were the others, led by the local elite, who continued to treat me as a pariah, perhaps even more intensely after my show at the celebration. But that's life, isn't it? Not everyone will like you. Not everyone will understand your story. The important thing is to find those who see beyond appearances, who see the human being behind the label. The following weeks brought concrete changes. The principal kept his promise and offered me a few hours of teaching, not at the main school, but at a small rural school that the town maintained for the children of the sugar mill workers. It wasn't ideal, but it was a start, a return to the profession I loved. Sweet orders increased significantly. Soon I needed Madison's help, who at 12 already showed talent for cooking. On Saturday afternoons, we transformed our small kitchen into a factory of delights: coconut candies, custard tarts, dulce de leche, ambrosia, taffy, peanut brittle. The list just grew, as did our clientele. Even the laundry service improved. Some families that previously paid me as little as possible now offered a fair value, recognizing the quality of my work. Some even recommended my services openly, without shame or hesitation. Slowly, painfully, our life began to stabilize. We weren't rich, far from it. We still counted every cent. There were still nights when dinner was just rice and beans. We still mended clothes until it was no longer possible to identify the original fabric. But we no longer lived with that constant fear of tomorrow, that suffocating uncertainty about how we would feed the children the next day. And most importantly, my children began to smile again. Christopher remained serious and responsible beyond his age, insisting on helping with expenses through his work at the pharmacy. But now he also participated in the school football team. He had friends who came to our house without caring about the malicious comments. Madison, my sensitive Madison, who had suffered so much with social isolation, now had some friends, not many, but loyal ones. Girls whose mothers had decided that the family situation was not contagious, nor morally corrupting. As for Jacob, my little one, he seemed to have recovered faster than the others, perhaps because he was younger when everything happened, perhaps because of his naturally optimistic nature. He ran through the town with his friends, climbed trees, played ball in the square, all the normal mischief of a boy his age. It was during this time that I received the second and last letter from Albert. The envelope had the same simple appearance as the first, but this time it contained only a note. No money. "Dorothy, I heard from acquaintances that you and the children are better. I'm glad. I won't be able to send more financial help. Life in the city is expensive, and A has fallen ill." The veiled reference to Anderson, whom he didn't even dare to name completely in the letter, affected me in an unexpected way. It wasn't anger or hurt that I felt. These emotions still existed, but they were more distant now, like old scars that only hurt when the weather is about to change. What I felt was pity. Pity for that man who threw away a family that loved him, a respected position in the community, everything for a life built on lies. What kind of happiness could he find that way? How could he look in the mirror knowing what he had done? I didn't respond to the letter. There was nothing to say. Our paths had irrevocably separated that night in the sacristy, and I was finally beginning to build a life without his shadow. The following years were of hard work, but also of small victories. In 1986, I managed to save enough money for a down payment on a modest small house on the outskirts of town. It was small, needed repairs, had a tiny yard, but it was ours. No one could evict us. No one could dictate rules about how we lived. Christopher, at 16, received an offer to work full-time at the pharmacy as soon as he finished high school, but I had other plans for him. "You're going to apply for college," I told him one night as we ate dinner. "For medicine?" He looked at me surprised. "Mom, that's impossible. It's too expensive, and I need to help at home." "It's not impossible," I replied, placing a savings passbook on the table. "I've been saving a little each month ever since your father left. It's not much, but it will cover the first year. For the rest, there are scholarships, part-time jobs. We'll find a way." Madison, then 14, clapped with enthusiasm. "My brother is going to be a doctor." Jacob, always practical even at 12, asked, "And Mari and me, Mom, can we study too?" "Of course," I replied, feeling a determination I didn't know I possessed. "You will all have an education. It's the only thing that no one can ever take from you." And so it was. It wasn't easy. Nothing in our life was easy. There were moments when I thought we wouldn't make it, that the obstacles were too great. Nights when I cried alone in my room, terrified by the responsibility on my shoulders. But we persisted. I continued teaching, making sweets, occasionally washing clothes to supplement my income. I worked from sunrise to sunset, slept few hours, lived with the minimum so that my children could have the maximum I could provide. In 1988, 6 years after the scandal that destroyed our life, I received an invitation I would never have expected. The board of the municipal school offered me my old position back. The principal who had fired me had retired, and his replacement was a young teacher from the city with more progressive ideas. "Your reputation as an educator speaks for itself, Mrs. Wilson," he said, "and I think it's past time for this town to leave certain prejudices behind." I accepted the position with tears in my eyes, not just for the better salary, the stability, the return to the work I loved, but for the symbolic meaning. I had survived, I had resisted, and now I was being recognized not for the scandal that marked my life, but for my value as a professional, as a human being. That same year, Christopher was admitted to medical school at a public university in the state capital. "The whole town is talking," he commented. Even those who still looked at us askance couldn't help but notice the achievement. Dorothy Wilson's son, the one from the scandal with the pastor, got into medical school. Who would have thought? The farewell was painful. My firstborn, my companion in struggles, leaving to build his own path. I cried like a child at the bus station as he boarded the bus, a small suitcase containing everything he owned. "I'm going to be very proud of you, my son," I said, holding his face between my hands. "Just promise you won't forget where you came from." "Never, Mom," he replied, his eyes watery. "Everything I am, I owe to you." Madison and Jacob clung to their brother, making him promise to write every week, to come back for vacations, not to forget them in the small town. When the bus left, taking my son away, I felt a mixture of sadness and accomplishment. It was the beginning of a new chapter for all of us, proof that the years of sacrifice had not been in vain. And so slowly, year by year, we built a new life. A life I never imagined for myself when I married Albert, when I believed that my path was already laid out as a wife and mother in a traditional family. A life that was harder in many aspects, but also more authentic, more truly mine. The town also changed. Time has that power to dilute even the most shocking scandals. New gossip emerged, new dramas occupied the sharp tongues. Gradually, I ceased to be the woman of the scandal with the pastor to become simply Mrs. Wilson, the teacher again. Of course, there were still those who never forgave me, though I never understood exactly what I had done wrong to need forgiveness. Mrs. Azalea, the mayor's wife, until the end of her days, would wrinkle her nose when she saw me pass. Some more traditional families still avoided close contact with us, but most moved on, just as we did. And with time, our story ceased to be defined by that night in the sacristy. It came to be defined by what we built afterward, by my children's education, by the respect we earned, by the dignified life we raised from the ashes of humiliation. And that's how, against all odds, against all judgments, against all the cruelty of a society that punishes the victims and often absolves the guilty, we survived. More than that, we triumphed. Time is curious, my dears. It passes slowly when we're in the middle of the storm, each minute seeming like an eternity of suffering. But when we look back, decades later, everything seems to have happened in the blink of an eye, like a movie we're watching, knowing the ending, but still being moved by each scene. The years following Christopher's departure for college were of constant work, but also of achievements I never imagined possible on that terrible night in the sacristy. Madison followed in her brother's footsteps in 1990. My girl, who had suffered so much from the isolation imposed by the town, was admitted to law school. "I want to defend people who have no voice, Mom," she told me, like we didn't have for so long. Seeing my daughter transform pain into purpose filled me with a pride that barely fit in my chest. Jacob, my youngest, was always the most studious of the three. In 1992, to the surprise of no one who knew him well, he was accepted into the top spot for an English degree. He wanted to be a teacher. He said he was inspired by me. Just imagine, finding inspiration in the mother who washed clothes, cleaned houses, and sold sweets to put food on the table. That might have been my greatest triumph. My children were never ashamed of our struggle. On the contrary, they drew their strength from it. With all three in college, the house became quiet. I, who had spent years dreaming of a little peace, suddenly found myself alone with my thoughts. I continued teaching at the municipal school, now as a full professor. I continued making my sweets, which were now famous not just in town, but in the entire region. People came from neighboring counties to buy them for parties and special occasions. On weekends, the house would fill with visits from my children. They came back whenever they could, bringing books, stories, new knowledge. My simple living room transformed into a center of heated debates about politics, philosophy, medicine, literature. It was as if the entire world entered through my door through their words. It was during one of these visits in 1994 that Christopher gave us the news. He had been invited to do his medical residency at a renowned hospital in the capital. "It's a huge honor, Mom. Very few recent graduates get a spot there." We celebrated with cornbread, his favorite since childhood, and the cheapest wine we found at the grocery store. That night, lying in bed, I cried, not from sadness, but from pure gratitude. Who would have thought that the son of the woman from the scandal would go so far? Madison graduated the following year and immediately started working at a law firm that primarily served low-income people. The salary was modest, but she didn't care. "Money was never our priority, was it, Mom?" she would say with that smile that lit up her eyes. Jacob was the last to graduate in 1996. Unlike his siblings, he decided to return to our town. "The capital is exciting, Mom, but I feel I can make more of a difference here," he explained. "I got a position as a teacher at the same school where you teach." Seeing my youngest son walking the same hallways where I was once humiliated, now respected and admired, was a form of healing that I didn't know I needed. That same year, something happened that I never expected. I received a letter. The paper was yellowed, the envelope simple, with no return address, but I immediately recognized the handwriting. Albert. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside, a brief letter. "Dorothy, Anderson passed away last month. Cancer." It was quick, thank God. I heard from mutual acquaintances that our children are doing well in life. A doctor, a lawyer, a teacher. "You accomplished what I never could have done alone. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I never stopped thinking about you all, about how I destroyed our lives due to my weakness. If any of our children ever want to meet me, I'll be in the city, at the address below. I'll perfectly understand if you prefer to burn this letter without showing it to them. Albert. I sat looking at that piece of paper for hours, sitting on the porch of my house. A house I bought with my sweat, where I raised my children alone, where I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. I felt only a strange peace, as if a chapter that had remained half open could finally be closed. I showed the letter to my children the next time they were all home. They read in silence, passing the paper from hand to hand. "What do you want to do?" I asked after the last of them finished reading. Christopher, always the most pragmatic, spoke first. "I see no reason to meet him now. Where was he when we needed him?" Madison hesitated. "I'm curious, I confess, but I don't want to open old wounds, especially for you, Mom." Jacob, my sensitive Jacob, surprised everyone. "I think we should go, not for him, but for us, to close this chapter once and for all." After much discussion, we reached an agreement. They would go, all three together, without me. I had done my part. I had protected my children, raised them, educated them. Now, as adults, they had the right to make their own decisions about the father who abandoned them. They went on a Sunday afternoon. They returned the following day with somber expressions and few words. I respected their silence. Only later, years afterward, Madison would tell me the details of that meeting. How they found a prematurely aged man living in a small, decaying apartment. How he cried upon seeing them. How he asked for forgiveness, knowing it was too late. "He asked about you," said Madison. "He wanted to know if you were well, if you had remarried." Remarrying never crossed my mind. Not out of bitterness, or because I still loved Albert. That feeling died on that night in the sacristy, simply because I learned to be sufficient unto myself. I discovered a strength and independence I didn't know existed in me. Besides, after everything I went through, the men in town viewed me with suspicion, the woman who couldn't keep her husband, or with that malicious interest, as if I must be desperate for male company. There were some suitors over the years, the pharmacy widower who occasionally sent me flowers, Florence's cousin who came to spend a season in town and always found excuses to stop by my house. Even the new town doctor, a distinguished gentleman from Indiana, invited me to dinner a few times, but I always politely refused. My life was complete with my work, my sweets, and especially my children. I didn't need a man to define me, to feel fulfilled or protected. That might have been the greatest lesson I learned throughout this journey. The 90s passed in relative tranquility. My children built their careers. I continued with my classes and my sweets. In 1999, at 49, I received an honor I never expected. I was elected Teacher of the Year by the Municipal Education Department. The same system that expelled me when I needed it most now celebrated me as an example. At the award ceremony, I looked at the audience and saw familiar faces. Mrs. Josephine, now very elderly but still lucid, smiled from the back of the hall. Florence, my faithful friend from so many battles, applauded enthusiastically. And there were my 3 children, their eyes shining with pride. That night, returning home with the small trophy in my hands, I thought about how life takes turns, how from the ashes of the greatest suffering, the most unlikely strength can be born. In 2002, Christopher married a fellow doctor, a lovely young woman named Helen. The following year, Madison also married a university professor she met at a law conference. Jacob took longer. He was always the most selective of the 3, but in 2006, he introduced us to Paul, an architect who came to work on the renovation of the main church. Yes, ironically, my son found love during the renovation of the same place where our family was shattered decades earlier. The grandchildren began to arrive. First, Christopher and Helen's twins in 2004, then Madison's daughter in 2007. And finally, to my surprise, Jacob and Paul adopted a girl in 2011, an adorable child who had been abandoned at the hospital where Christopher worked. Seeing my family grow, seeing my children raising their own children with so much love and dedication, was the greatest reward I could ask for. Each time one of the little ones called me Grandma, I felt that all the suffering had been worth it. In 2014, at 64, I officially retired as a teacher, but I didn't stop working. I transformed my small production of homemade sweets into a more structured business. Dottie's Sweets became a brand known in the region. Jacob helped me officially register it, create beautiful packaging, expand distribution to other towns. It was during this time that I received the news. Albert had passed away, a stroke, according to the letter sent by a lawyer. He left no assets, just a request that his children be informed of his departure. I felt a strange melancholy, not for the man he became, but for the man I once thought he was, the father of my children, the companion I believed I had. A life wasted in lies, ended in loneliness. I told my children, of course. They received the news with contained sadness, more for a lost possibility than for real mourning. After all, how can you feel the loss of someone who was never really present? "I'll pray for him, Mom," said Madison, always the most spiritual of the three, "that he finds the peace he couldn't in life." The town also changed over the decades. It grew, modernized. New families arrived, others left. The old prejudices, although never completely disappeared, were diluted by time and new generations. Today, at 75, I look back and see a path I never imagined I would travel. A path of pain, yes, but also of discoveries, of humiliations, but also of silent triumphs, of hidden tears, but also of profound joys. My hair is white now. My hands, once marked by the hard work of washing clothes, are now marked by time and decades of making sweets. My body no longer has the energy of before, but my spirit, my spirit is stronger than ever. When my grandchildren ask me about the past, about what life was like back then, I tell them adapted versions of our story. They are too young to understand all the complexity, all the pain. One day, when they're older, they'll know the complete truth, not to cultivate grudges or resentments, but to understand where they came from, the strength that runs in their veins. Because that's what I discovered, my dears, throughout this improbable journey that was my life. Our strength comes precisely from the moments when we think we can't go on. When I look back at that night in the sacristy that seemed like the end of the world, I now see that it was just the beginning of my real life. A life where I discovered my strength, my courage, and my ability to unconditionally love my children. You ask me if I have regrets. Of course I do. I wish I had had more time to simply be a mother instead of having to be a provider, protector, and warrior. I wish my children hadn't known the world's cruelty so early. I wish the love I once felt for Albert had been reciprocated with honesty. But if you ask me if I would change anything, if I could go back in time, I don't know how to answer. Because each stone in the path, each closed door, each tear shed in the bathroom so my children wouldn't see me falter, all of this transformed me into the woman I am today. And honestly, I like this woman. I respect her. I admire her tenacity. Therefore, my dears, never define yourselves by the betrayals you've suffered, but by the strength you found to overcome them. Never allow others' judgments to determine your worth. Never give up when the whole world seems to be against you, because in the end, what remains are not the moments of despair, but the small victories. Not the humiliations, but the acts of courage. Not the losses, but what we build from them. This is my story. A story of pain, yes, but above all, a story of overcoming. A story that began with a red scarf found by chance on an almost summer day, and that ends here in this room, surrounded by the love of a family I built with my own hands against all odds. And if there's one thing I've learned in all these years, it's that true love, be it from a mother, a friend, a partner, never dresses itself in lies. It presents itself naked, vulnerable, imperfect perhaps, but authentic. It's in that authenticity that we finally find our peace. Thank you for listening to me, for sharing a bit of my journey. If my story touched your heart, I ask that you leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear that. Even in the darkest nights, there is always the possibility of dawn. Where are you watching from? Leave it in the comments. I would love to know that my story is reaching so many different places. And remember, no matter what life presents you with, you are stronger than you think. I am living proof of that. A loving hug from this grandma who learned the hard way that our greatest strength is born precisely when we think we have no more strength to continue.